These communist prisoners of war were released last month in Saigon. 27,000 communist soldiers were sent back to North Vietnam in exchange for the 600 American prisoners released by Hanoi. The communist prisoners were not allowed to talk to the press, and the exchange of prisoners of war was overshadowed by allegations that many Americans had been tortured in captivity by the North Vietnamese. But America's South Vietnamese allies are now being accused of torturing their political prisoners. These men have just been brought in police trucks from a South Vietnamese prison. This is the first morning of their freedom. They've been kept in cages so small that they've not been able to stand upright for 5 years. The muscles of their legs have wasted away. Their legs are paralyzed. These released prisoners all told us they've been tortured in the South Vietnamese prisons, which are financed and sometimes administered by the Americans. The prisoners of war on both sides have now been released. But the Vietnam Peace Agreement also ruled that all political prisoners on both sides be let out of jail within 90 days. That deadline expired at the end of April, but thousands are still in jail. And opponents of President Thieu's government, many of them not communists, allege they've been tortured in the jails of South Vietnam. Amnesty International, which fights for the release of political prisoners throughout the world, has mounted a campaign this year to stop the disturbing increase in the use of torture. Tonight, World in Action follows its previous inquiries into Ulster and Turkey with an investigation into allegations of torture of political prisoners in Vietnam. In the propaganda war that's gone on in South Vietnam since the ceasefire, each side accuses the other of holding enormous numbers of political prisoners. South Vietnam says that the communists are holding 60,000 political prisoners. Many observers say this figure is too high. North Vietnam says that the Saigon government holds 300,000. That too is exaggerated. Amnesty International puts the true figure between 70,000 and 120,000, and they're being held in some 550 prisons. What is certain is that President Thieu and the Americans have turned South Vietnam's once ramshackle administration into one of the most formidable government machines in Asia. The armed forces, with 1 million men, are the fourth largest in the world. Another 1.5 million men are in the local village militia. There are also 122,000 police. One able-bodied South Vietnamese male in 3 carries arms for President Thieu, whose political opponents are now almost silent. Free elections in South Vietnam are supposed to follow the ceasefire agreement. If President Thieu released the tens of thousands of political opponents in his jails, his chances might be damaged. This welcome home for President Thieu is supposed to be spontaneous. In fact, it's as regimented as any Moscow parade. One of the villagers at the parade gave us this document, which showed how the government machine turned out its support. The invitation was to all the villages in the Hoc Mon district, and it read,
"To receive the President of the Republic of Vietnam who is returning to the country. If the above person is absent, we will temporarily keep his identity card."
That is a threat. In Vietnam, it's a serious offense to have no identity card. It means that the villager could be arrested on suspicion of being a member of the Viet Cong. The Saigon government machine now keeps a dossier on every citizen over 15 in South Vietnam. To enter or leave Saigon, everyone must show an identity card at a checkpoint. Emergency laws decree that all forms of demonstration or opposition to the government will be considered pro-communist. To ensure loyalty since the ceasefire, a new law says that all houses must fly a government flag outside them. Those who fail to do this will be assumed to be pro-communist. The president advised that anyone seen taking down a flag could be shot on sight. While we filmed at the Saigon law courts, we saw evidence of the government's stern policy. This truck contains newly arrested political suspects picked up at a peace demonstration. Even after the ceasefire, it's an offense for people to call for peace. The Saigon government considers such neutralism a sign of weakness that plays into the hands of the communists.
Decree Law 93, Article 2, shall be considered as pro-communist neutralist a person who commits acts of propaganda for and incitement of neutralism.
Trun Tuc Lin is a judge in the courts of Saigon and a neutralist, one of the non-communists in South Vietnam who opposed the Thieu government. He himself was arrested along with a group of Buddhists. They demanded an end to the fighting and negotiation with the communists.
I was arrested in February 1968. Perhaps that surprises you a lot, but in this country they even arrest a judge. They feared that I was forming a coalition government with elements from the National Liberation Front in order to try and stop the fighting.
Judge Lin was taken to this building, the main police headquarters in Saigon, and focus for many complaints of torture.
Most, or I could say all of those who've been arrested there, were political detainees. They interrogated them during the night, and I'm sure that those who were being interrogated were tortured. I heard strange noises, screams, human bodies falling from the ceiling to the floor. In the rooms to the right and left, above and below me, I heard screams. Yes, I saw human rags coming out of these rooms. They couldn't walk. They had to be held up by other prisoners. They walked like cripples. They had bloodstains on their clothing. Their faces were swollen, and there were others who came out of those rooms on stretchers.
The Buddhists are among the hardest hit of the non-communist groups who oppose the Thieu government. Throughout the long history of the Vietnam War, they've urged successive Saigon governments to make peace with the communists. Buddhist monks publicly burnt themselves in the streets of Saigon in protest against the fighting. Buddhist leaders were imprisoned on political charges when they advocated setting up an alternative neutral government which would sue for peace. Buddhist leaders in Saigon told us they had lists of more than 4,000 Buddhists who were at present in prison. Mrs. Win T. Bin's two 15-year-old daughters, Tan and Tao, were arrested for being members of a Buddhist peace group. They're still in jail.
My daughters, when they were at the police and security headquarters, their arms were tied like this behind their back and then hung up. Then they were laid on a bench with one end lower than the other. Then they poured water into their nostrils. They were tied to the bench and water was poured into their nostrils until their stomachs were full of water and they were suffocating. Then guards stood on their stomach and made them vomit the water. They also gave them electric shocks. They made my daughters bite the wire between their teeth and gave them shocks. My daughters told me this when I visited them. The Saigon authorities said that my daughters took part in pro-communist activities.
Are they communists?
They are not communists.
Mrs. Bin went to the authorities to protest about the treatment of her daughters. She was also arrested and claims she was then tortured herself.
I was hung high up with my arms behind my back until I collapsed. Then they cut me down. Sometimes they beat me everywhere on my body. Sometimes they beat me while giving me electric shocks. One man fixed the wires and 3 others beat me with sticks.
The majority of the political prisoners still held by the Saigon government are described as communist sympathizers. Many were arrested as part of an American plan called Operation Phoenix. Operation Phoenix was designed to wipe out by wholesale imprisonment and assassination any suspected communist sympathizers in the villages. It was funded and controlled by the American spy agency, the CIA. Operation Phoenix set about the massive task of making the towns and villages secure for the Thieu government. It's alleged that many villages who are not communists or unfortunate enough to live in areas where the communists were strong have suffered because of Operation Phoenix. K. Barton Osborne, a former intelligence officer with the U.S. Marines, testified to a U.S. congressional inquiry on how Operation Phoenix was run.
Anything at all can be interpreted as possible orientation away from loyalty to the Saigon government, and for that they can be suspect.
Was it your impression that many of the people picked up under that program were innocent?
Oh, yes. There was no reason to conclude their guilt. They were, in fact, interrogated to death, not having determined if they had any connection with the NLF. Of course, it's as much a serious offense to be neutral in South Vietnam politically as it is to be openly and overtly aligned with the NLF. If I had gone over to see them about a certain report one afternoon, they said, well, we have your suspect here, were interrogating him, and when we arrived at that hooch that I mentioned, they were drawing the person out. They were carrying him out. They had inserted a dowel into his ear and tapped it through to his brain until he had died. The Marines were kind of embarrassed at that because it was an administrative error. They hadn't gleaned from him any information. I am really suspicious as to whether or not the man had any information to give. Twice during the spring of 1968, I was invited along on airborne interrogations where we would go up in the Marine Sikorsky helicopters, and they would take two suspects along, both with their hands tied behind their backs in white shorts. And what they did was they had two detainees, one whom they were through with, and the second who they were interested in interrogating. They would take them up, antagonize the first one by running him up to the door of the helicopter, shouting at him, upsetting him, and reducing him in essence to more or less a catatonic state of fear. And they would tell him and make it obvious to the second person, the second detainee, that if he didn't tell them what they wanted to know in terms of information or local structure or whatever they were trying to get out of him, that they would throw him out of the helicopter. And the third or fourth trip to the door, they would wing him out of the helicopter. And of course this had the effect of antagonizing the second suspect, the one they were interested in, into revealing any kind of information. And he would immediately start babbling. And whether or not the information had any relevance or not, whether it was accurate or not, he was interested in one thing, quite understandably, and that was to get back safely to the ground and not be thrown out as the first man had.
We investigated the effects of the Phoenix program in the South Vietnamese city of Quang Ngai. We found 1,000 suspected communist sympathizers in the city prison. Next door was an interrogation center with another 600 suspects. We were told that U.S. intelligence men were often seen in this compound. Groups of suspects are regularly taken from this center to the local hospital after interrogation. The condition of these political suspects was described to us by Jane and David Barton, American physiotherapists who'd worked in the local hospital for 2 years.
We've seen prisoners with various ailments, some ailments that they attribute to torturing. We've seen people with paralysis, hemiplegics, and people that have been beaten on the head, causing a brain hemorrhage and thus paralysis to one side or the other of their body.
How recently have people been admitted after they've been tortured?
People come to the prisoner ward at the hospital often immediately after they've been tortured, because there are times when the prison officials are afraid that they might die in the interrogation center, and they would prefer not to have a dead body at the interrogation center that they would have to get rid of, and thus they allow the person to come to the hospital.
17 of the 23 people who were in this hospital in April alleged they'd been tortured in the interrogation center. World in Action's cameras weren't allowed into the prison ward, but the Bartons took film and stills which show some of the effects of Operation Phoenix.
Well, the torture that we see the results of most frequently is a torture that results from people having been given electricity. They usually attach the electrical wires to people's toes and fingers or sensitive parts of their bodies. People say that they go unconscious when they're given the shocks, and then when they recover consciousness, this will be repeated 3 or 4 times. And then the person will be allowed to rest for a certain period of time, perhaps to think about it and to dread it's happening again, and then it will be repeated 1 or 2 more times after that until the interrogators are satisfied that the person is innocent or in fact may need other types of torture.
This old woman is 67 years old, and she was picked up in a district. She was accused of carrying rice to the other side because her family lives on the other side. She was carrying rice at the time she was picked up. She's now hemiplegic. She's paralyzed on one side of her body because she was beaten.
She said during the 3 months she was in the interrogation center, she was tortured so that she then lost consciousness, and later she found herself a hemiplegic. This is another picture of a young girl that was beaten on the head and causing a skull fracture. We x-rayed and have a x-ray evidence of this having caused a brain hemorrhage, and this made her a hemiplegic. She's the young woman that admitted to the Americans that she was in fact tortured because her father a long time ago had in some way supported the other side and had been in jail for a few years. So because of this vague connection, they were able to pick her up without pressing any specific charges against her.
The reasons vary a great deal, and it seems that most of the reasons are quite arbitrary. Either they are not carrying the proper identification papers, or they're going towards an area which is under the control of the National Liberation Front, or they are simply have relatives that have also been picked up.
This woman was the only prisoner among the 23 in the prison ward who openly declared herself a communist. All the others, she said, were not on her side. Our interviews with these prisoners suggested that many had been arrested in an arbitrary way. The American Phoenix program must have been judged a political success, for the Saigon government claimed it was killing 1,000 communists a month. Phoenix has now been taken over by the South Vietnamese, who've changed its code name to F6. This is the F6 agent in the village of Dak Lap, 40 miles west of Saigon. The village is considered to be in a safe area, but the F6 agent was taking no chances. He'd arrested 4 people the week before we arrived because he suspected they were communists. 2 were old women who were found outside the village police checkpoint after curfew with baskets of food. Another was a 16-year-old girl who read out a peace poem in her school after the ceasefire. And the 4th was a farmer who was visited in the night by a man with a rifle. His wife claimed the visitor was the man's cousin, who was a government militiaman from a nearby village. But the F6 man says they were both communists. President Thieu's most controversial jail for political prisoners is on the island of Con Son, 60 miles off the coast of Vietnam. The prison is financed by the Americans and has American advisors. Official government figures say there are over 11,000 prisoners on the island, and some have been there for over 10 years. The world's attention first focused on Con Son prison in 1970, when an American journalist and a group of American congressmen discovered that some prisoners were being kept in cages. Sometimes as many as 5 prisoners were kept for years in cages so small they could never stand up. There were also complaints that guards threw lime over prisoners. In response to protests, the Americans administering the prison set about building more humane cages. This prisoner, pictured in this cage 3 years ago, was a woman of 60, Mrs. Ba Shao. She was blinded when lime was thrown in her face. We discovered she's now been released after 10 months in the tiger cages.
We did not have enough food. We could not bear any longer shrimp paste and salted dry fish, so we asked for vegetables. We were told there were no vegetables. Women in the tiger cages were upset and shouted in protest. The warden then threw lime powder on us and beat us. For 52 days, we were not allowed to wash ourselves. Our clothes were rotten and our hair fell out. Our skin was decayed.
Mrs. Ba Shao was arrested in 1968 by the Americans under the Phoenix program. She kept a lodging house where a Viet Cong suspect had been arrested.
What happened when you were taken to the police headquarters?
Sau khi bị đem tới tổng nha đó thì có chuyện gì xảy ra thật?
When I was taken to the police headquarters, I was asked if I was a Viet Cong. I said I did not know what a Viet Cong was. They said, if you are not a Viet Cong, we will beat you until you admit you are. And if you admit you are, we will beat you until you no longer dare to be one.
124 political prisoners from the tiger cages were released 2 months ago. They'd been in the cages so long that their legs were paralyzed. The Saigon government discourages journalists from talking to them, but we found a small group who'd been hidden by the government in an old people's home in a village outside Saigon. The freed political prisoners were being treated by a former U.S. Air Force doctor, John Champlin.
This man is a young man, 24 years old. He was a high school student when arrested, and he was kept in leg irons for about 4.5 years. You can obviously, it's obvious that he's got a problem with his legs, and he's one of the 124 prisoners who is paralyzed. He has lost the sensation in both legs from about mid-thigh down. You can see the atrophied muscle in his calf. You can also see that he has contractures. This man's degree of contracture and the length of time that he was in the leg irons makes it less likely that he'll ever be able to walk again. Some prisoners have told me it was so crowded in the old tiger cages at times that the guards couldn't even light a match. It was so deficient in oxygen. This prisoner was beaten in 1970 while he was in the what they call the cattle cages on Kongshan. And following the beating, he was urinating blood, and following that, he urinated a good deal of calcium. So he has some kidney disease, which needs to be further diagnosed and treated, and there are inadequate hospital facilities here for that. He also has burns on his thigh from tear gas grenades that were fired into his cell during a period when the prisoners were demanding more food and better treatment. And the tear gas was fired in such concentration that it caused burns of the skin and blinded them for several days. He still has burns from that. And the new tiger cages were constructed a little bit differently than the old ones, but there is still an opening at the top of the cage where the guards can walk along and throw lime down on the prisoners for what they call prisoner control. Okay, this prisoner was an NLF soldier, and he was arrested in 1968, and he was kept in tiger cages approximately 3 years. He was placed in leg irons with his body on top of a bed, so that his legs from the knees down were hanging over the edge of the bed in leg irons close to the floor. In that position, circulation was very poor. His legs became very swollen. And despite the fact that he's very young and was in good health, he lost the use of his legs within 3 months. And he was in leg irons for a total of over 1 year. After he was arrested, he was beaten. He was given what's called the boat trip, in which they force water into his lungs and then force him to swallow the water, and then they beat him on the stomach. He was also hung from the ceiling, swung back and forth, and beaten. The guards call that the airplane ride.
Was there an American advisor in the prison all the time?
Khi anh bị tra tấn, có một cố vấn Mỹ làm ở nhà tù không?
Tại đó thì có rất nhiều người Mỹ, nhưng mà họ không trực tiếp nhưng tra tấn thôi.
Yeah. He said there were many Americans in the prison at that time.
So it was reasonable to suggest they were aware of what was going on. Huh?
Yes.
We tracked down another group of 9 prisoners in this police compound. They'd also been released from Kon Son Prison Island. They were now in a village 70 miles from Saigon. Unfortunately for the 9 released prisoners, they'd promptly been imprisoned again by a local police chief who didn't want them talking to his villagers. We told the police chief he was acting contrary to the peace agreement, and he reluctantly released the 9 prisoners into our custody on condition that they were taken to a local Buddhist pagoda away from the villagers. Of the 9 prisoners, 7 were paralyzed, and all alleged they'd been tortured on Kon Son Island. They also complained of a variety of diseases, including TB, heart conditions, and malaria, that they contracted in the tiger cages. We asked the 9 prisoners about their personal history. Lam Hung, farmer, alleged torture with electricity, water forced into his lungs, hung by his arms. In the tiger cages since 1967, legs now paralyzed. He didn't say what his politics were. Huin Ban Chin, declared communist cadre, alleged that pins were forced under his toenails and electrical wires were attached to his penis. In the cages since 1969, legs now paralyzed. Win Tai, farmer arrested by Phoenix, not accused of communism, has no idea why he was jailed, alleges beatings, not put into the tiger cages so his legs function normally. Pham Ban Ko, communist cadre, alleges torture with electricity, hung by his arms for 2 hours, not put in a tiger cage so his legs function normally. Pham Van Mao, non-communist student arrested at a protest demonstration, alleges torture with electricity, ribs broken. In the tiger cages since 1969, legs now paralyzed. Ni Van Tan, communist cadre, alleges torture with electricity, hung up by his arms, tied behind his back. In the tiger cages since 1969, legs now paralyzed. Son Yut, Cambodian, studying in Vietnam, alleges water forced into his lungs, hung by the arms. Arrested in 1962, held in the tiger cages since 1969, legs now paralyzed. Mi Van Min, non-communist student, alleges being placed in a barrel of water which was beaten until he urinated blood. In the cages since 1968, legs now paralyzed. Bo Kwong, communist soldier, alleges water torture, beatings on the soles of his feet. In the tiger cages since 1968, legs paralyzed. There's no certainty about the number of political prisoners still held in the jails of South Vietnam. We tried to make our own estimate with the help of Amnesty International.
We started with the biggest prison, which is at Con Son Island, where the tiger cages are. Official government figures say there are 11,850 political prisoners there.
Then at Chi Hoa, which is Saigon's main prison, there are officially another 7,000 prisoners.
Thu Duc, just outside Saigon, is the main prison for women. It contains between 1,600 to 1,800 women.
At Tan Yep prison near Saigon, there are further 1,600 to 1,800 prisoners.
Each of Vietnam's 37 provinces has its own prison. The one we filmed near Quang Ngai had 1,000 prisoners in it. Amnesty says that provincial prisons usually contain between 500 to 1,000 prisoners.
Each of the 37 provincial prisons has an interrogation center attached to it. The one at Quang Ngai had 600 prisoners in it. A U.S. advisor said that there are at least 10,000 prisoners held in interrogation centers.
Finally, in Vietnam, large towns and some villages have their own prisons. The U.S. aid budget for the financial year 1974 speaks of
a jail administration program and being and functioning in 552 facilities by the financial year 1973.
Amnesty estimates that these extra 480 local prisons contain between 40 and 100 prisoners each,
giving a total of 552 prisons with between 70,000 and 118,000 political prisoners who should have been released by the end of April. Last week, President Thieu made a gesture and said he would now release 5,081 of them. The allegations of torture made by the American prisoners got worldwide coverage, gravely embarrassing North Vietnam. It remains to be seen if world opinion will create enough international pressure to discover the truth about what's happening inside the jails of South Vietnam.